talent here in Connecticut. Great guy, has lots of information. He's been in the entertainment industry for like 107 years. He won't tell me how old he is, but he's been in the entertainment biz for a long time. So tune in on May the 3rd for that.
All right, everybody, I'm back. I'm just letting you know that you're all being recorded. And again, I'm Ann Votom, the president of the new chapter of iBirbs. We're so glad to have you here for sit virtually at the desk of Clement Clarke Moore. And I would like to introduce our special guest today. I can't believe we landed this special guest. I'm so excited. All we had to do was ask. Her name is Debra Schmidt Bach, and she is the curator of decorative arts at the New York Historical Society. And she is going to present everything you could possibly think of about the desk of Clement Clarke Moore. And this is the actual desk that we believe that he wrote A Visit from St. Nicholas on, or maybe he didn't. There's some controversy here, and we're going to stir the pot. And thank you so much. Can we have some virtual applause for our new friend, Debra?
Now, how will this work with the slides? You'll put the slides up for me?
I'm going to do that right now.
Okay. So we can go to the first slide.
Is this it?
That is it. Let me just make sure that, oh no, the first, okay, well that's the title slide, but the next slide would be great. Okay, there we go. So yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I'm really excited to give you a brief overview of the history of this desk. This desk that you're looking at in the photograph is the desk that we believe Clement Clarke Moore wrote A Visit from St. Nicholas on. And before we talk about the desk and some of the attribution issues we've faced with it, I want to tell you a little bit more about Clement Clarke Moore, because I think that's very relevant to this story. Most Americans know him as the author of the classic poem, but he had actually a very long career as a theologian and a scholar of ancient Greek and Hebrew languages. He was a professor at the General Theological Seminary for many, many years, for most of his career. He was also the son of two New Yorkers, one of whom his father was a very influential theologian named Bishop Benjamin Moore, and his mother was Charity Clarke Moore. And it's important to keep in mind who his parents were, because his mother was the daughter of a British Major General named Thomas Clarke, who came to the New York colony in the early 18th century and then decided to stay. And her mother was a member of the Fish family, an old New York family. And that's important also because the Fish family intermarried with Peter Stuyvesant's family very early on. So two important facts to keep in mind. Now, a little bit more about Clement Clarke Moore's father. His father was the rector of Trinity Church in New York City and was named the bishop of the Diocese of New York in 1801. He also served as president of Columbia College from 1801 to 1812. And he was in attendance, we believe, at George Washington's inauguration, which happened downtown in New York City in 1789. And he gave the last rites to Alexander Hamilton. So that's a little bit of background about Moore's lineage. Moore was actually a prolific writer. He wrote many, many different poems and articles. He also wrote a very well-known Hebrew and English lexicon, a dictionary, in 1809. So all of these activities were what he was engaged in as a regular part of his life. He married in 1813, and he and his wife, Elizabeth, had 9 children between 1815 and 1826. Unfortunately, many of the children died young, either as children or into their early adult years. And then Moore's wife died fairly young as well in 1830. And so he was left with 7 children when she died. And he never remarried and spent a lot of his time taking care of his children. That was their education and raising them were priorities to him. So the desk that you're seeing, this is the desk open. So that's we refer to it as a secretary and chest of drawers. So underneath are some drawers, and the desktop folds down, and then you see lots of niches in the desk. And I think if you go to the next slide, you get a close-up of some of the niches. Yep, there you go. And just to go one further to the next slide, this desk was made by a New York City cabinet maker named Michael Allison. Michael Allison was in business downtown in New York City, basically from about 1800 into the 1840s. The desk, the piece of furniture I'm showing you next to it is another example of Michael Allison's furniture. Michael Allison's furniture was not the highest style furniture in New York of the period, but would definitely have been the kind of desk that a man like Clement Clarke Moore would have used in his home office. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is a black and white photograph of an autographed manuscript that Clement Clarke Moore gave to the New York Historical Society. In 1862, the librarian of the Historical Society asked Moore to write out the poem himself and to give that to the society, which he did right before he died. As many of you know, Clement Clarke Moore is believed to have composed the poem originally in 1822 at his home. And then for Christmas Eve that year, he read the poem to his children. Now, the poem was then published a year later in 1823 in the Troy, New York Sentinel. And it was published as written by an anonymous poet. Mm-hmm. And we also don't know precisely who gave the newspaper the poem. Moore did not acknowledge himself as the writer of the poem for many years, and there were a lot of different theories about why that was, that I don't think we really need to get into today. But he was publicly attributed as the writer of the poem in 1837 in a book of poetry called the New York Book of Poetry, which was published that year. He then acknowledged his own authorship of the poem in 1838 and published the poem under his name in 1844. So there was some lag time between when he publicly acknowledged the poem and when he wrote it. Let's see. So Moore's description in the poem really has become the public legacy of who Santa Claus is now today. He described a very jolly Saint Nicholas. And I think it's important to keep that in mind as we talk about the debate a little bit. So let's talk about the debate about the authorship of the poem. The debate centers on an analysis, textual analysis of the poem, of the syntax of the poem, that was done by a Vassar College professor around 2000. And he published a book. And in his study, he felt that comparing the way the poem was written, it seemed like the syntax and the text was very, very different in the way it was composed than it is compared to other of Moore's poetry. Now, that set off a lot of debate about the authorship of the poem. There also, over the years, had been some debate about the poem being authored by a member of the Livingston family from upstate New York. And that was pretty easily disproven. The member of the family who was attributed historically died before the poem could have been written. But so there was some debate floating around well in advance of 2000. But many other scholars have since then focused on looking at Moore's writing, and right now the theory has essentially been disproven that Moore and I think most people still believe that Moore wrote the poem, that the poem is very much in keeping with the kind of syntax he's used in other poems. And there are several different scholars who have taken on that part of the debate. So, but I think it's important in thinking about the debate and thinking about whether or not Moore authored the poem, to look a little bit at where Moore's idea may have come from. And I think the poem makes more sense when you think about it by looking at the other cultural activity that was going on during the period. So Moore was probably influenced in part in a lot of his writing, not just this poem, by some of the other writers of the day, particularly Washington Irving, who wrote a very famous history of New York, now known as Knickerbocker's History of New York, which was a comedic history of New York. But within that story, he depicts Saint Nicholas and talks about him as the patron saint of New Amsterdam. Irving's book actually was part of a whole movement to recognize people of Dutch heritage who were living in New York. And so this came about during a time when the city was starting to change quite a bit. So people from families that were traceable back to the original Dutch colonists were very, very concerned about some of the changes that were happening, and that the old city was quickly disappearing in front of them. And you know, we definitely understand how quickly the city changes today. So Knickerbocker history is what this kind of genealogical and heritage push was known as, was very popular among upper class New Yorkers, primarily gentlemen. And Washington Irving, in fact, founded the St. Nicholas Society in 1835, for members of New Yorkers of Dutch ancestry. And actually, Washington Irving was very involved with the New York Historical Society as well. And I didn't realize until I started to put this PowerPoint together that St. Nicholas actually is the patron saint of the New York Historical Society.
Wow.
Yeah, it's very interesting. If you could go to the next slide. So Moore's description of St. Nicholas also came after another famous broadside or engraving illustration of St. Nicholas, and that's what I'm showing you here. This shows you an image of St. Nicholas that was commissioned by the New York Historical Society in 1810 for their first celebration of the Festival of St. Nicholas, which at that time was held on December 6th. And this particular image that I'm showing you is a picture of a reprint of the original image from 1810, and this was done in 1864. So the Historical Society commissioned this from a man named Alexander Anderson, who was a former physician and became a very well-known engraver in New York during the period. And his depiction of St. Nicholas merged old Dutch folklore about St. Nicholas, and as well as kind of current day from that period of the way St. Nicholas was depicted. But it also brings in different elements that start to relate it to New York as well. But you see in this slide a fireplace and a good girl and a bad boy. And so that's where we start seeing some of that imagery. If we could go to the next slide. So another example of some of the art that came out of this Dutch heritage movement is this painting, which is also in the New York Historical Society collection, by Robert Walter Ware. And Ware's depiction also kind of merges ideas that were in Washington Irving's description of St. Nicholas in his history of New York. And I also wonder if maybe some of his inspiration came from Clement Clarke Moore's poem. This was painted in 1837 Robert Ware was another member of these Knickerbockers. So the heritage was, understanding the heritage was both kind of a personal as well as a somewhat professional interest in of his. There are 6 paintings of St. Nicholas by Ware that are known to survive. One is at the Smithsonian, one is at the Historical Society, another at the Brooklyn Museum, and then 3 are in private hands. And they're all a little bit different. So circling back to the desk, and if we go to the last slide again.
Anna had his finger up alongside his nose getting ready to go up that chimney.
Yes, absolutely. And I believe that Washington Irving makes an allusion to that as well. So here's the desk. Now, we believe that the desk belonged to Moore and was used by him. We can't prove it and document it definitively, but knowing a little bit more about how the desk was given to us, I think helps to understand that, at least in my eyes, I think it probably was his. The desk was donated to the Historical Society in 1956 through the family of a woman named Harriet Butler, along with her own letters that she had written describing the ownership of the desk and its connection to Clement Clarke Moore. Now, Harriet Butler, interestingly, was the daughter of a man named Reverend David Butler. Reverend David Butler presided over St. Paul's Church in Troy, New York. Young Harriet Butler was, the story goes, was at the Moore's house when Clement Clarke Moore read the poem to his children in 1822. And it is believed that when she heard the poem, she wrote it down in her own personal copybook. And then 1 year later, she is the candidate for the person who gave the poem to the Troy Sentinel, where it was first published in 1823. So she was very much enamored with the poem. She may have been the person who gave it to the Troy Sentinel, and I think her background certainly, and the fact that she was from a family from Troy, New York, certainly makes that plausible. Now, how Harriet Butler came to be in possession of the desk, we don't know for sure, and that's what we can't, that's one of the 2 things we cannot confirm about it. Harriet Butler never married, so the desk descended through a cousin and then through his family. But I do think it's important to understand that Clement Clarke Moore and Harriet Butler's father were very close associates, and in fact, one of her brothers was named Reverend Clement Moore Butler. So that gives you a very quick overview of the history of the desk and why we say we believe that it belonged to Moore and we believe that he wrote the poem. It kind of, I think this outlines for you a little bit of the story behind the controversy and, you know, attribution of authorship by Moore. But I'll turn it back over to you if you have questions.
Everybody, you are all unmuted, please. Questions for Debra?
Debra, this is Dave Banks.
Hi.
Curious little thing. Sometimes you notice the most unusual things, but looking at the second painting you showed, the one of Santa coming out of the fireplace.
Yes.
I noticed that on the floor, there's a clay pipe broken.
Yes.
I wonder what the significance of that is.
I believe that there was a tradition in early Dutch New York of breaking pipes to celebrate St. Nicholas Day. Now, I haven't done extensive reading on that, but that's, I have read that. I haven't done extensive on that, but that's, I have read that.
So everybody, I'm hearing some background noise really quickly. I'm going to mute everybody quickly. And I'm going to allow you to unmute yourselves. When you want to speak, you can speak. Okay, do we have a next question? You can unmute yourselves. If you have a question, you can unmute yourself and just ask it. Oh, I know you're burning. Carol, there we go, Carol.
Yes. Do you have anything else in the Historical Society related to Christmas in New York, those early years?
We don't have as much as you would think. Our library actually has more material than the museum collection. We have two different collections at the Historical Society. We have a very extensive library collection with over, I think at this point, 4 million volumes. And then we have the museum collection, which it consists of paintings and anything three-dimensional. So we do not have a lot of material related to early Dutch celebration practices. We have some related to the 19th century, but not a huge amount. Much less than I certainly expected when I first went to work there.
Is it safe to say that Santa Claus is a New York invention? Is it the Santa Claus as we know him in America? Is he a New York invention?
You know, I think certainly St. Nicholas, as we know him, was a New York invention. And despite the fact that St. Nicholas was a Catholic saint, it appears that early Dutch New Yorkers really stayed true to celebrating St. Nicholas and revering him as a patron of children, as a patron of New Amsterdam. I've also read that he was the patron saint of the greater colony of New York, although I've only read that in one place. So yes, it does appear, like many things, that the whole idea of celebrating St. Nicholas in a very wholehearted cultural way may have originated for the United States in early colonial New York.
Any other questions? Come on, guys, this is your big chance.
I was looking up, just one question here. I was looking up the other day, Santa Claus in Iceland.
Ah.
Santa Claus is not a nice guy in Iceland.
No.
Far more like the German Krampus.
Mm-hmm.
And I ran into an Icelandic Santa suit that I really love, but then when I started reading about it, I said, oh, well, guess I'm not going to go that way.
Yeah, and my understanding is that Clement Clarke Moore's poem was really one of the first to depict St. Nicholas and then subsequently Santa Claus as a very jolly figure. The St. Nicholas depicted in the Alexander Anderson engraving isn't quite as jolly and friendly, and even in the Ware painting, Santa, in some of the different paintings, Santa can be a little more or less friendly and a little menacing sometimes. So he's depicted a bit differently.
Now, Clement Clarke Moore owned Chelsea. His estate was Chelsea that became the actual neighborhood in Manhattan of Chelsea. Is that correct?
That's correct. So Clement Clarke Moore's mother inherited that land from her father. And when she died, Clement Clarke Moore inherited the land. And he actually is the person who began to parcel out that land and sell it. And some of that land was also, he specified that the land had to be set aside for the General Theological Seminary, which is still down there. But it was named by her father after a hospital in England. And that's where Chelsea comes from.
This is Dan in Elyria. Where did the 8 reindeer come from? Was that one of Clement Clarke Moore's inventions, or was there something behind it?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry to say.
I have a question. In you know, the Western European tradition, Saint Nicholas often appears with a companion figure, and they vary from country to country, from city to city. Any idea why that tradition didn't hold over for the early Dutch colonists?
I think it did hold over for some period of time. There was a Blackmore who was often shown with St. Nicholas or described with St. Nicholas. I'm not sure why that didn't continue on. you know, it may have been just that it was appropriated in a way to focus on the Knickerbocker heritage rather than other characters. And I think there was also an attempt at the time to make St. Nicholas less of a religious figure and more of a cultural figure. So that may have contributed as well.
All right, everybody, we are at 3:29. I'd like to honor everybody's time. This is one of those little short ones in the middle of your work week. And can we all move in really close, everybody. Suck it in, get in really close. We're about to take a photo. Okay, here we go. And George, can you get your video ready to do a group ho, ho, ho? Or you know what? Let's just get this going. Can we all do this for Debra? I'm gonna mute everybody. Here we go. And
Lots of jolliness there.
let's give Debra an actual round of applause. This was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me. Very nice to meet you all. I wish all of my Zoom meetings ended with ho, ho, ho.
That was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stay on
Thank
a little
you.
bit more. I want to stay on a little longer if you all wanted to stay on. But Debra, thank you. We want to honor your time. And I
Very
can't believe
welcome.
you did this. This was
Thank you
great.
much. Yeah.
Take care, everyone. Thank you again.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. That was terrific.
It
That
was.
was awesome.